and thank you for being my second guest on my YouTube channel, Infinite Regress.
No worries.
And Harry is a frequent participant on my Discord channel. So Harry, I'm going to first ask you about moral realism. You consider yourself a moral realist, is that correct?
That is correct. Yes. Yeah. There's many ways to cut that, but yeah.
But so what is your explanation of moral realism and why you believe in it?
Sure. I guess the way I think about moral realism is that there are objective facts to be had about what's right and wrong. So I could be objectively wrong about what I think is good or bad. That's how I'd cash it out, I think.
Okay. And you don't buy the argument made by moral anti-realists that that all of these ideas we have regarding morality are simply your own personal opinion or the opinion of society in which you live, or something along those lines.
I think it touches on a really important point, which is that the way that we define categories and how we think about the world around us is really important. So, and how do we come up with those definitions, and what counts as an objective definition? And so they're touching on something there which is absolutely fundamental to science: is how do we define categories? How do we define chemistry, biology, health? And I think moral realism has exactly that same problem, or morality has that same problem. But all other subjects seem to have got beyond this. So there may be different notions of health and how people cash it out. Maybe some people will define health differently as someone else. But that doesn't stop there being something there that is objective, i.e. the functioning of a particular living system. And that's the way I see with morality. It has all the same problems as health or all these other subjects in terms of how to define and how to go about understanding our subjective idea of what they should be. And it's also, it's got the same objective basis, or could have the same objective basis. You just need to define or understand what that is and pick something that makes sense, both within our language and how we think about it on a more colloquial level. So health has this, chemistry has this, biology has this, physics has this. We start off with the natural philosophies, and then we moved on, and then we start to define categories in useful ways. And so the way I see morality is the most useful way to define it is just about conscious experience. So whether we're experiencing something that feels good or feels bad, and the long-term consequences that on our experience. And I think this is a fairly good foundation for it. And as soon as you set up that foundation, there are then objectively better ways to operate.
Well, okay. Now, quite often what a moral realist might define morality as whatever minimizes suffering. But, playing devil's advocate here, if we were all to drink the poison Kool-Aid tomorrow, we could minimize suffering because we wouldn't be alive to suffer. Right. So I wonder if there needs to be a more nuanced understanding of what morality is beyond just minimizing suffering.
Right. And again, really good point. I think there'll be there's loads of aspects to this. I mean, we already research animal suffering and how to decrease it. And there are loads of different metrics we use for that. And so I think we're going one step further. The premise of moral realism is just that it can be that there are objectively better ways. And then from that, we can say, okay, well, what are those ways? How do we measure it? What are the problems with a particular scientific discipline? What are the metrics that we're going to use? And I kind of see those as two separate things. One's the philosophical underpinnings of whether we want to define it like this, or whether it makes sense to define it, how we define it. And then after that, it's all really important, but it kind of follows on from moral realism. We're arguing, we've already accepted the notion that it exists, and we're just thinking about better ways to define it.
Okay, yeah, and I also want to ask you, you and I are both vegans, and
yes.
So, but now my entrance into veganism was really based upon. In fact, some people might not call me a vegan because I was motivated initially by concerns about the health of eating meat, dairy, and eggs, and in addition, the health of even eating vegan junk food, as we're aware. That's everywhere in our supermarkets nowadays, but
increasingly so, yeah.
Yeah, and but in your case, as I understand it, you embrace veganism for different reasons, right?
Yeah, so I did an environmental science undergrad, and I became vegetarian from that. And then throughout my environmental science undergrad, I realized that actually vegetarianism doesn't make any sense if you think about the underlying principles behind it, which is kind of environmental sustainability. And then when you look at it from a moral sense, it doesn't make any sense, because dairy cows have the same pain, or maybe even more pain than cows that are bred specifically for meat. So I started to view that more, and then I became vegan from that, basically just through exploring those philosophies. And then I started a PhD at a livestock research farm, and I discussed with scientists all the time, and it became more and more clear in my mind. The more and more I spoke to people, even those people who understand the complete nuances of it, it just seemed to be the right position, and that basically solidified me in being vegan. There are some aspects, I suppose, I might differ from other vegans in the sense that I have the philosophical principle of just like with moral realism, that it's all about animal suffering. So if there are things that we're eating that have or seemingly have no suffering attached to them, let's say mussels, for instance, then I've got no problem with it. Same with honey. Do insects feel pain, or does honey? And it doesn't seem to be the case. And if it's proven to be the case, then I'll shift my position. But because that's my philosophical underpinnings, I'm not so attached to category of animal. If it turns out that fungi feel, then great, then they'll get chucked into that category, or whatever it may be.
Okay, now I want to deal with some of maybe more what I perceive as the more difficult issues. Like the seeing eye dog. A blind person desires a seeing eye dog to help him get around. Now some people, maybe the more militant vegans would say, no, it's still not permissible to train a dog to be a seeing eye dog for a human being, because that's really animal exploitation. Now,
right.
I would say that on balance, you're minimizing suffering if you let the blind person have the seeing eye dog. So you agree with that, right? Okay.
Yeah. So that's where I think that I don't care so much about category. Often, a lot of the poor arguments for veganism rely on touchy-feely arguments. So it feels bad that this is the case, or animal exploitation, which comes with a load of emotional cachet. But actually, when you unpack it, how are you defining animal exploitation? Is it having a dog help someone to cross the road? Is it exploitation to have a pet in the first place? And I just think these are the wrong questions. We should just go back to the original principle: is the animal happy or not? Would it be, is it living a life that's worth living? I think those are actually the questions we need to get back to.
Yeah, if the dog was, had the cognitive capabilities, you could negotiate with the dog and say, hey, how would you like to be my seeing eye dog for $10 a week or something like that? I'll give you extra tasty dog food in exchange, or something like that. But it doesn't work that, because the dog really can't sign a contract. We're left kind of maybe intuiting as to whether or not he's suffering as he's being our seeing eye dog or not. And or maybe he actually, because he's a social animal, maybe he enjoys being a seeing eye dog. We don't know, right?
Yeah, and I think this actually leads us down a philosophical path where I can imagine a situation where eating meat is ethically better than being vegan, because we could come up with a situation where there are vegan foods and agricultural practices which cause more suffering in terms of the people involved and the conscious creatures than rearing an animal and then eating it. So because the underpinnings are actually just about animal suffering, or the suffering of conscious beings, you can actually come up with a philosophical scenario, or even just a real scenario, right? In which it's actually more ethical not to be vegan. My stance on that is that you need so much information about the particular system to make that choice, that those are very rare. And actually, it's this thing where, well, how should I act in the world? And the easiest thing is just to bet on the probability that actually veganism causes less suffering than let's say eating meat. There might be situations where that's not the case, but I need to know about the system. And 9 times out of 10 when I'm picking a sandwich from a supermarket or from a petrol station or gas station, then I don't know. I don't have any of the information about where that pig's been bred, and I have very little information about where my spinach has come from. But my bet right then, I think there's a higher probability that where my spinach has come from is going to cause less suffering than the rearing of that particular pig.
Well, okay. Let me bring up an issue that I remember dealing with in a Facebook discussion on my local vegetarian society, where there was this in northern Indiana. I live in near Indianapolis, but in northern Indiana, there's this very small town. People pass by it on the way to Michigan, north of here.
Yeah.
But in that small town, there's this restaurant owned by self-proclaimed vegans. Now they put a few vegan items on the menu, which is kind of rare in a small town like that, because usually you see vegan items in the bigger cities, or cities, suburbs, what have you. But they put a few vegan items on their menu. They proclaim to be vegan, but most of their menu still has some meat and dairy and what have you. Somewhere in some discussion on our Facebook page, somebody accused them of not truly being vegan because they have they have some non-vegan items on their menu, and we debated whether or not that was either ethical, or whether or not they're truly vegan, or if they should not call themselves vegan or what have you. And of course, the restaurant owner eventually found out about that discussion and said that she was very offended by it, because she felt like she was introducing vegan food to a population that had not really had much experience with it before.
Right.
And I imagine you probably sympathize with the restaurant owner quite a bit, right?
Well, again, so it comes back to how do you deliver a message, and how do you encourage moral progress within society? And being violent and not very nice is a terrible way to spread a message. People leave a conversation with the emotional valence more than with the logical conclusions. So if someone's having a discussion with me about veganism and they love steaks, my aim for that conversation is not to convince them not to eat steaks, but to like me, and like the fact that I don't, and be fine with the fact that I don't eat meat. That would be my first step. So that they go, oh, Harry is a vegan and he's a nice bloke. And then they associate the two. So they say, okay, because at the moment there's such bad publicity with veganism due to this type of activism, that people are turned off by the emotion, and they don't ever consider the logical arguments. So that's always the first step. That Sophism is really important. And if we were to go back to moral atrocities like slavery, or trying to break those, it wasn't to break that required slow progress, and it required people to come round to the arguments and ideas. And to have that shift requires people to be on board with what you're saying, and people aren't going to listen if they think you're an idiot, or if they think you're a really nasty person. That's just that's just human nature.
Well, it's interesting you brought up the issue of slavery, because I just thought of how slavery got abolished in the United States, and it's very interesting because there was this debate about how much did Abraham Lincoln really oppose slavery, right? Because he was a politician. He was somebody in the persuasion business. He wasn't just somebody out there posturing to say, "Hey, I'm more anti-slavery than anybody else." Yeah, he was in the business of, I guess, trying to get elected. I assume he cared about that quite a bit, and he also seemed to have some anti-slavery views. But he would also try to comfort the American South by saying, I have no plans to abolish slavery where it's currently in existence. And but in a sense, one could argue that his tactics, actually advanced the cause of the anti-slavery movement maybe more effectively than somebody who had just taken the most radical anti-slavery position in 1860 and gotten defeated in the election. Never gotten elected. You could see that.
He just needs to draw back, right? So what's the quickest way that we can get people to adopt seemingly morally right positions, or positions that reduce suffering? That's the question, right? Is it through stamping your foot and refusing to eat people who eat meat? Or is it through joining them at the table and discussing with them? Or is it through even eating meat with them and then taking them to vegan restaurant? What degrees can we do? How quickly can we get out of this unnecessary suffering business? Sure. And for me, that is a different question entirely, and people haven't quite clicked onto the fact that it could be, for instance, that actually me going to a steakhouse with my brother because he wants to eat a steak, and I just ordered like a side of cauliflower and some chips and whatever, and then I get to chat to him anyway about it. Or me, for instance, so for my dad's birthday, for instance, I bought him very sustainable beef. So it's beef from the research farm that we're at. I know how it's reared and so on and so forth. But what that means is then I can have a discussion with him about what is more ethical beef to eat and what are the best ways to work within that system. So for me, it just seems like what I want to do is I want to win people over to the philosophy that we should be reducing suffering and we should have agricultural practices and we should set up a human society in which there isn't so much suffering. And once they've convinced them that philosophical position, I think it's only a matter of time before at certain periods of their life, they are vegan. So they'll make decisions that we would consider to be vegan decisions. I think there's a slightly more tricky thing, which is that how does this relate to the environment, to food security, to people's livelihoods? And that's much grayer water because we're not talking about philosophical premises. We're actually talking about empirical evidence. And that's where I lose a lot of people. So a lot of the scientists that I talk to will say that there isn't enough evidence for it or that the absolutism is not the way. And so there are different conversations to have in those circumstances. But I agree. I think that, that this idea of how do we get people to adopt things that are seemingly more ethical or certainly reduce suffering. And the first port of call is, well, how is my message going to be received?
Right. And even in the communities that I've kind of spent time, which is the healthy eating community, which also happens to support pushing the meat and the dairy and the eggs off the table, there's always this idea that, should you tell somebody just to go full bore, 100% healthy eating on day one, or do you transition them? You let them eat, you introduce them to some vegan burgers that aren't particularly healthy as a transition away from the meat, and there's lots of debate about that. And there's also people who will say, hey, it's unrealistic to get people to eat as healthy as you're asking them to eat. Let them have some potato chips, or let them have some, some unhealthy foods once in a while. And the argument back is, hey, people are going to cheat anyway. I don't need to encourage them to cheat. So there's always this debate as to whether or not we should do baby steps or if we should plant the flag where our goal is, and just try to move people along that way. I guess I tend to be, based on my interactions with people, I guess I tend to think that, well, there may be different situations where, maybe you want to explain to them that, yes, as you mentioned earlier, dairy isn't necessarily more humane than just eating meat. And you may want to tell them that.
More inhumane.
Yeah, it may be more inhumane. And you may want to tell them that, although it may discourage them because they may feel like they're making moral progress as they push away the meat and start eating more cheese. But in reality, they're maybe actually increasing suffering or keeping it the same.
Right. And it's really weird the way I haven't actually looked into how vegetarianism formed, but it seems very strange that there's this distinguishment has been made. Because when you look, even if you look closer, it doesn't make any sense, right? I find that people's inner critics are already pretty brutal. Like the way we speak to ourselves about what we're doing, we tend to be, it tends to be a lot of shame, a lot of guilt, things like that. So I think outside groups don't really need to encourage that. And in fact, if you pick a diet or an exercise regime or whatever, in which there's hard lines, in which there's external punishment as well as that internal guilt of not doing it, people just fall away. They just don't like that inner critic and that other people also talking about it in that manner. And and then it's not unsustainable, right? Because the voice in your head is you're trying to reach for an ideal that's not there, that you're finding very difficult to reach already. And so there's a lack of enjoyment. There's a lot of punishment from within yourself and from outside people, and then you don't want to be part of the group. So in order for a habit to be sustainable, it needs to be enjoyable. And so that's again, it comes back to this sustainability thing and how the message will be received and whether it will be run with or not. And so if you're incredibly militant about things, or if you set such hard goals that the punishment seems too painful to want to continue, then people will just fall out of line, and they won't follow it. Right,
and this gets to a question. By the way, I know that you're limited on time, so you just let me know when we have to get going. But the one thing I did think about as you were mentioning that is I think in religion and maybe politics and perhaps issues like veganism, and similar issues. I really believe that peer pressure is a huge factor, right? I really believe that. I mean, I really believe that a lot of people will stay Christian if they're in a Christian community and their friends are Christian, their spouse is Christian, their parents are Christian, their in-laws are Christian. And I believe that people would be more likely to go vegan if all of your friends, hey, you find out all your friends are vegan, and it would just become a comfortable thing to do. But and I think that's one reason why veganism hasn't caught on that much, is because the vegan always seems to be the odd man out, at least in most communities. It
will reach a critical point, though. I think that it will reach a point in which it becomes increasingly popular, and then people will want to be part of it or be interested in it, and then it will be discussed. And I like Jonathan Haidt's idea about in-group and out-group, and how in-group you can use negative stimuli to encourage, or virtual signaling to encourage people to stay in line, but out-group you can't use that behavior. If I'm trying to appeal to someone, punishment doesn't work. And so just to understand that it's about welcoming people into the fold. And I do think that people are becoming increasingly aware of plant-based diets, and increasingly aware of just reduction of meat consumption, and actually this model of meat with every meal doesn't really work for your health. And then there's increasingly environmental concern that's entered kind of the moral and political sphere in the past kind of 60 years. And that's growing, so that will encourage people to think about things more broadly. So I do see a sea change, and for me, that sea change may take several decades to come, and it may not be the absolute vision of veganism. But what it will mean, I think, is moving towards a world in which there is so much less that we've really reduced unnecessary suffering. So there are certain types of food that we would eat now that the pleasure that it gives us is just not worth the suffering that it causes other things. And lots of pig farmings like that, foie gras, things like that. There's lots of things that we wouldn't bat an eye about eating, but actually I think in decades to come we'll look back and think, oh right, yeah, we did that, and it would just be an evolution of our kind of our collective moral conscience.
Well, I hope you're right, because I'm not as optimistic as you are, but
but
I'm
young, right? So
well, I don't know. I mean, I've talked to some, like a registered dietitian that I really respect, and he has been part of you might call it the vegan or vegetarian movement. He really would call it the health movement, really since the late 1970s. And he says, hey, people, when it comes to health anyway, he says Americans are eating worse than they ever have been, based on some measurements, right? And and so when everybody says, hey, I think, when anybody says in the discussion forum, hey, I think we're making progress here. I just saw some plant-based, I saw some tofu in this gas station, where we're making progress. And then he will point out, no, you look at the statistics, you look at the empirical data, people are eating fewer fruits and vegetables per day or whatever, and he'll just demoralize you.
We still increasing, but per capita meat consumption is still increasing. It's less than 1%, but it's still increasing worldwide. So, and even in modern world, modern economies and advanced agricultural economies, it's still, we're still meat consumption is still increasing. So there's still a lot, we haven't even got peak meat consumption yet. So, there's still a lot to turn around. And I know that the argument against the health aspect is that it is easier to eat healthier when you've got more options on the table. So if you had a bit of fish involved with that, then it would be easier to be healthier because the meals are less complicated, or we understand the nutritional information better. And so I think you need all three prongs in order to fully justify a vegan diet. So you need the moral arguments, you need the health arguments, you need the environmental arguments. And I think just through probability, it then becomes one of those things where through imperfect information, it makes more sense to pick a plant-based diet.
Sure.
That's how I see it. Yeah.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground, so I think I'm prepared to let this conversation end right here.
Yes.
And I look forward to having you on again.
Yeah, let's do it. Let's do something. Let's set up some questions, or we can even discuss some of the broader implications of these ideas.
All right. Have a good day, and I'll see you at the book club.
Yeah. Thanks, Mike.
You bet.